A young woman steps onto a plane, ready for a smooth flight. But little does she know, a simple misunderstanding with a flight attendant will soon turn into a battle for her dignity. What happens next will leave you questioning how far some people will go to judge others based on their appearance. Stay tuned to find out how one moment of prejudice sets off a chain of events that could change everything. Before we get started, don't forget to subscribe, like, and comment below. We'd love to know what you think about the story. The airport was buzzing with energy that day, filled with the usual sounds of rolling luggage, chattering travelers, and intercom announcements that echoed across the terminal. Amid the sea of passengers rushing to catch their flights, a woman walked with quiet confidence. Sophia Martinez, dressed in a sleek, elegant outfit, moved gracefully through the crowd. She wasn't in a hurry, nor was she looking for attention, but there was something about her that made her stand out. Maybe it was her poised demeanor, or perhaps it was the subtle aura of power she carried with her. She clutched a first-class boarding pass tightly in her hand, her steps calm but purposeful. As she approached the check-in counter, a flight attendant, Claudia Harper, looked up from her paperwork. Claudia was a professional, well-trained, and used to dealing with all kinds of passengers. She gave Sophia a quick once-over, scanning her from head to toe. Something about her didn't seem to fit in with the usual first-class passengers, at least in Claudia's mind. Perhaps it was the way she carried herself, too understated for someone boarding first class. It was the sort of prejudice that Claudia didn't even realize she carried, and she quickly pushed it aside. After all, first class was for paying customers, right? Claudia greeted her with a practiced smile, though a subtle hesitation lingered in her voice as she checked the ticket. "First class is this way," she said, her tone polite but distant. Sophia didn't seem to notice the slight shift in attitude. She nodded with a soft smile, thanking Claudia as she made her way toward the security checkpoint. But as the line for boarding grew longer, Claudia couldn't shake the nagging feeling that Sophia didn't quite belong there. She muttered under her breath, just loud enough for her colleague, another flight attendant standing nearby, to hear. "Not sure about this. First class seems to be getting too accessible these days," Claudia said, almost as if speaking to herself. Her colleague, who had heard the remark, shifted uncomfortably, but didn't respond. After all, Claudia had been a flight attendant for years, and no one questioned her decisions. Sophia passed by, unaware of the comment, as she walked towards the gate. She felt a slight flutter of excitement as she approached the boarding area. Today wasn't just about flying, it was about the new chapter in her life. As a billionaire investor, she was used to the luxuries and privileges that came with her status, but that didn't mean she flaunted it. Sophia had built her success through hard work, not flashiness, and she preferred it that way. Today was a special day. She had worked long hours and fought hard to get to this point, and this flight was her reward. It was a quiet celebration of everything she had achieved. When it was her turn to board, Claudia was standing at the gate, scanning boarding passes with her usual practiced smile. She looked at Sophia's pass, and for a moment her eyes narrowed. The first-class ticket was real, but something about Sophia didn't sit right with Claudia. She hesitated for a second before glancing down at the boarding pass again, a flicker of doubt crossing her face. "First class is that way," Claudia said, pointing toward the economy section instead of guiding her to the luxurious first-class cabin. Sophia paused, confused, and then showed Claudia the boarding pass again, her voice calm but firm. "This says first class," she explained, holding it up slightly for her to see. The words hung in the air for a moment, as if waiting for Claudia to accept the obvious truth. But instead of apologizing or simply directing Sophia to her seat, Claudia's eyes hardened. There was a brief, almost imperceptible shift in her posture, and she stiffened her smile. "There must be a mistake," she said, her tone now colder. "Please, head to the economy section. We need to keep the line moving." Sophia blinked, a little surprised at the insistence. "There's no mistake," she replied softly but firmly. "I'm a first-class passenger. Here's my ticket." She extended the boarding pass again, hoping this time the issue would be resolved. But Claudia didn't take it. Instead, she crossed her arms and looked at Sophia with a skeptical frown, her tone now edged with something that felt almost dismissive. "I'm sorry, but you'll have to go to economy," she said again, her voice a little sharper. Sophia felt the weight of the moment, the tension in the air thickening as she realized what was happening. Her grip on her carry-on tightened, but her voice didn't shake. "This is my seat. I'm not moving." Her words were simple but filled with quiet strength, a silent declaration that she would not be pushed aside. Behind her, a few passengers were starting to take notice, their murmurs slowly growing louder. Some looked at her with curiosity, others with pity, but no one stepped forward to question the flight attendant's authority. It was just a quiet standoff, but the tension was palpable. Claudia took a step forward, lowering her voice even more. "I'm not asking again. If you don't comply, I'll have to escalate this and call security." The words were a thinly veiled threat, and the tone was no longer about politeness. It was clear that Claudia's patience had worn thin. Sophia's heart raced, but she didn't show it. She had been through worse. But still, something in the pit of her stomach told her that things weren't going to be as simple as she had hoped. There was a long pause as they locked eyes, Claudia's expression now one of determination, and Sophia's one of calm resolve. She could feel the eyes of the other passengers on her, but she didn't flinch. She wasn't going to back down. Not now, not ever. At that moment, something shifted. The entire boarding area seemed to hold its breath, waiting to see what would happen next. The minutes seemed to drag on as Sophia stood her ground, refusing to let the situation escalate further. The murmurs around her grew louder, but she kept her composure, her face still calm and unreadable. Claudia, who had been trying to maintain a professional stance, couldn't hide the tension in her expression. She had always prided herself on handling situations swiftly and without drama, but this felt different. Something about Sophia, her quiet defiance, was pushing her limits. Sophia knew she couldn't let Claudia's words get to her. She had dealt with more challenging situations before, boardrooms full of skeptical investors, media scrutiny, and countless encounters where people underestimated her because of her gender or appearance. This was just another challenge, but with a much smaller audience. As Claudia hovered near her, clearly unsure of how to proceed, the other passengers watched the scene unfold. Some exchanged glances, unsure whether to intervene or just let things play out. A few passengers behind Sophia shifted uncomfortably, their impatience growing. It wasn't just a simple boarding process anymore. It had become an unexpected confrontation. Then, a voice from the back of the line spoke up, breaking the silence. "Is everything okay here?" The voice belonged to an older woman, perhaps in her late 50s, who had been observing the situation quietly. She was seated in the first-class section, and her tone, although polite, carried an undercurrent of concern. She wasn't trying to intervene inappropriately, but there was a clear sense of disapproval in her question. The others in the line seemed to perk up as the woman added, "This doesn't seem right. She's got a first-class ticket. Let her go through." Claudia quickly turned her attention back to Sophia, but the interruption had shifted the energy in the boarding area. There was now a subtle shift in the way people were perceiving the situation. Some were starting to question whether the flight attendant was in the wrong. The older woman's words hung in the air, a challenge to Claudia's authority. Sophia glanced briefly at the woman, her lips curling into a small, appreciative smile. It was a subtle acknowledgement of her support, but Sophia knew better than to rely on others to resolve this for her. She was the one who had to stand up for herself. And so, with a steady breath, she turned her attention back to Claudia. "I'm not going anywhere," Sophia said, her voice even but firm, her resolve clear. "This is my seat, and I have every right to be there." The words were simple, but they carried weight. She wasn't asking for permission anymore. She was simply stating the truth. Claudia seemed to hesitate, her eyes flicking nervously from Sophia's unwavering gaze to the few passengers who had begun whispering amongst themselves. The atmosphere was becoming charged with the tension of unspoken judgments. Was Claudia really going to escalate this? Was she going to continue denying someone their rightful place because of assumptions? Sophia didn't wait for a response. She turned and started walking towards the first-class section, her posture straight, her steps purposeful. There was no arrogance in her movement, just quiet confidence. As she walked past the line of economy passengers, she felt the eyes of the room on her. She could sense the whispers, the disbelief in their gazes. But she refused to let it affect her. She wasn't about to let Claudia's prejudice determine her worth. As she reached the entrance to the first-class cabin, Sophia heard Claudia's voice behind her again, this time more insistent. "Excuse me, ma'am, but I must insist you sit in economy. There's been a mistake with your ticket, and if you refuse, I'll have no choice but to call security." Sophia didn't even flinch. She continued to walk towards the plush, spacious seats that were reserved for first-class passengers. Every step felt like a small victory, even as the confrontation continued to unfold behind her. She was ready to take the next step, whatever it might be. This wasn't just about a seat on an airplane anymore. It was about standing her ground, about refusing to be treated like she didn't belong. Her resolve had already been tested once, but now, with every passing second, it was being tested even further. Sophia was no longer worried about how she would be treated. She was focused on one thing. She had earned her seat, and no one, not even Claudia, would take that from her. As Sophia took her seat in first class, the tension in the air seemed to follow her, a heavy presence that lingered in the cabin. She placed her carry-on in the overhead compartment with practiced ease, her movements steady, though her mind was still racing with everything that had just transpired. The cabin around her, with its plush seats and calming ambiance, contrasted sharply with the storm she had just walked through. She took a deep breath, glancing out the window at the clouds outside, trying to shake off the strange feeling of isolation that had come over her. It wasn't just about the confrontation with Claudia, it was about the way she had been treated, as though she didn't belong in this space, despite the fact that she had a first-class ticket, just like everyone else. For a brief moment, the weight of the situation settled in her chest. The whispers of the other passengers, the sidelong glances she had received as she made her way through the plane, stung more than she expected, but she refused to let it show. This wasn't her first time being underestimated. She had faced judgment before, often from people who had no idea who she was or what she had accomplished. It always stung, but she had learned how to push through it, how to rise above it. As she settled into her seat, her phone buzzed in her pocket, breaking the silence. It was a message from her business partner, Jack. "How's the flight going?" the message read. Sophia stared at the screen for a moment before typing back. "It's fine. Just some drama with the staff." She didn't feel like explaining the full details just yet. She had more important things to focus on, but even as she texted, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. She glanced around, and sure enough, several passengers were eyeing her curiously, some with subtle disapproval, others with open judgment. It wasn't the first time Sophia had been treated like she didn't belong, and she was certain it wouldn't be the last. But today, it felt different. There was something more personal about it, something that hit too close to home. The injustice of it all seemed to echo in her mind, growing louder with each passing second. Why was she being treated like this? Was it her appearance? Was it the way she looked, the way she carried herself? Or was it something deeper, something rooted in the assumptions people made about her because of her wealth? Just then, Claudia appeared again, moving through the cabin with a practiced smile. She didn't look directly at Sophia, but her gaze briefly flicked in her direction before quickly moving on. It was as if she was trying to avoid acknowledging Sophia's presence, perhaps hoping the situation would resolve itself without further escalation. But Sophia could feel the air crackle with tension every time Claudia passed by. The flight attendant's attempts at normalcy felt forced, as though she was putting on a show for the rest of the passengers, pretending like everything was fine, when in reality things couldn't have been further from it. Sophia didn't let it bother her. She had bigger things to focus on. But just as she was starting to settle in, she noticed Claudia slowing down near her seat, her movements almost too deliberate. There was something in her eyes now, something different from before. The confident, almost smug attitude that Claudia had earlier seemed to have disappeared, replaced by a subtle unease. She stopped just a few rows away from Sophia and stood there for a moment, her eyes darting nervously between the other passengers and Sophia herself. "Excuse me, Miss Martinez," Claudia finally said, her voice much softer than before, almost apologetic. "I just wanted to check on you and see if everything was okay. Is there anything I can get you to drink or anything you need?" The offer felt insincere, almost as if she was trying to make up for her earlier behavior. But Sophia wasn't fooled. The shift in Claudia's demeanor wasn't genuine remorse, it was fear. Fear that she had crossed a line she couldn't undo. Sophia looked up at Claudia, meeting her gaze with calm but unwavering eyes. "I'm fine," she replied coolly, her tone still polite but distant. "Thank you for asking." There was no need to elaborate further. Claudia's discomfort was enough to speak volumes. Claudia lingered for a moment longer, as though she were hoping for some kind of response, some kind of reassurance that she hadn't completely ruined everything. But Sophia said nothing more, choosing instead to turn her attention back to her phone. She wasn't interested in accepting the flight attendant's attempts at fixing something that couldn't be fixed so easily. The silence between them stretched on, filled only by the low hum of the plane and the occasional shuffle of passengers as they settled into their seats. Claudia didn't move away immediately, still hovering by the aisle, but after a few tense moments, she finally gave a stiff nod and walked away, her steps slower now, more hesitant than before. Sophia watched her retreating figure, not with satisfaction, but with a quiet sense of inevitability. This was just the beginning. Claudia might have backed off for now, but the tension between them hadn't disappeared. It would be there, lingering like a cloud, until it was addressed head-on. Sophia let out a quiet sigh, her fingers tightening around her phone as she reread the message from Jack. She didn't respond right away. Instead, she glanced out the window again, trying to clear her mind, trying to focus on the bigger picture. She had worked hard to get to where she was. No one, no flight attendant or passenger, had the right to make her feel small. Not today. Not ever. Her phone buzzed again, this time with a message from her father, Victor Martinez. "Keep calm, darling. Stay strong." The words were brief, but they carried the weight of years of experience. Her father had always been a source of strength for her, teaching her to hold her head high and never let anyone make her feel less than she was. "I'm proud of you," the message finished. Sophia's lips curled into a faint smile as she read the last words. Her father always knew what to say. She quickly typed back, "I will, Dad. Thanks." The rest of the flight unfolded in a strangely tense silence. Every time Claudia passed by, her movements were more subdued, her earlier confidence replaced with an unsettling hesitation. It was clear that she was avoiding Sophia, a stark contrast to the way she had interacted with other passengers. Sophia couldn't help but notice the flight attendant's attempts to be extra efficient with everyone else, offering drinks, making polite conversation. But when it came to her, Claudia seemed to go out of her way to avoid any further contact. It wasn't subtle, and Sophia couldn't help but wonder if Claudia was silently hoping she would just forget about what had happened. Sophia tried her best to ignore the growing discomfort, her mind focusing instead on the text messages that kept appearing on her phone. The first was from her business partner, Jack, asking if she'd arrived at her destination safely. The second was a reminder about an important meeting she had scheduled with a potential client later that week. And then there was a third message, this one from her father, Victor. Remember, you can't control what others think or say, but you can control how you react. Keep your head high. I love you. Sophia smiled as she read his message, her father's words always managing to ground her, no matter what. It wasn't easy to be a woman in the business world, especially one with the kind of wealth and influence that she had. She had spent years earning the respect of others, proving that her success wasn't just about money. It was about hard work, intelligence, and making the right choices. And yet, here she was, being treated like she didn't belong in the very seat she had paid for. It was a reminder that prejudice came in many forms, even in the most unexpected places. As the flight continued, the moments of tension became harder to ignore. Sophia felt the eyes of the other passengers on her, their gaze lingering just a little too long. She could sense the whispers, the judgment. Some passengers glanced at her with pity, while others seemed almost amused by the situation. No one stepped forward to challenge Claudia, though. No one seemed willing to speak up. It was as if they were all too comfortable letting someone else bear the weight of standing up for what was right. But as the hours passed, Sophia couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to change. The initial discomfort she had felt earlier was now mingling with something else, a quiet, growing sense of defiance. She had earned her place here. No one had the right to take that away from her, no matter how hard they tried to justify their actions. It wasn't just about the seat, it was about standing up for herself in a world that too often overlooked women like her. And then, as if on cue, Claudia reappeared. This time, there was no pretension in her movements, no over-the-top attempts to serve the passengers or charm them with her smile. She walked slowly down the aisle, her eyes scanning the rows until they landed on Sophia. There was no smile this time, no attempt at warmth, just a cold, practiced neutrality as she stopped beside Sophia's seat. I just wanted to check again if there's anything you need, Miss Martinez," Claudia said, her voice awkward, almost too soft. Sophia looked up at her, her expression unchanged. She had dealt with enough people trying to apologize through thinly veiled actions. "I'm fine," she said, her voice calm but firm. There was no need for small talk, no need for pleasantries. It wasn't about the drink or the snack she was being offered. It was about the lack of genuine apology, the lack of true accountability for what had happened earlier. Claudia hesitated, her eyes flicking nervously toward the other passengers, as though she expected them to be watching her every move. In a way, they were. A few passengers were already glancing in their direction, their curiosity piqued. Claudia's discomfort was palpable, and it was clear to anyone paying attention that her usual confidence had slipped. She seemed almost unsure of herself now, her earlier bravado replaced with something far less certain. For a moment, there was only silence between them. The sound of the plane's engines hummed in the background, a steady, unchanging presence, but the air between Sophia and Claudia seemed charged with an unspoken tension. Finally, Claudia spoke again, her voice just above a whisper. "I'm sorry," she said, the words seeming to hang in the air for a moment longer than necessary. "I didn't mean to offend you. I didn't realize who you were." Sophia didn't respond right away. She was studying Claudia, watching the way her posture had shifted, how the strong, assertive flight attendant now seemed almost fragile, as though she were bracing herself for some kind of rebuke. But Sophia wasn't interested in that. She wasn't interested in empty apologies or half-hearted attempts at making things right. The damage had already been done. She stood up, her movements smooth and deliberate, her gaze still locked on Claudia. The others around them watched in silence as Sophia made her way toward the first-class galley. She could feel Claudia's eyes following her, but she refused to let herself be swayed. It wasn't just about getting her seat back, it was about showing Claudia and everyone else that this wasn't the way things were supposed to be. As Sophia walked down the aisle, the passengers remained quiet, almost as if holding their breath. They had all seen what had just unfolded, and now they were waiting to see how this would end. Sophia reached the galley where the flight attendants were preparing drinks and snacks for the first-class passengers. She stood there for a moment, gathering her thoughts. The situation had escalated more than she had expected, but now that she was in the galley, she felt a strange sense of clarity. This wasn't just about proving her point to Claudia, it was about making sure that this behavior wasn't swept under the rug, that people like Claudia couldn't get away with treating others as if they didn't belong. No one should have to endure what she had experienced today. Claudia, now a few steps behind her, seemed to hesitate before following. Her steps were slower than before, almost tentative, as though she was unsure whether she should approach her at all. Sophia could hear the flight attendant's heels clicking nervously against the floor, the sound growing louder as Claudia approached. "Miss Martinez," Claudia began again, her voice much softer now. There was an edge of uncertainty to her tone that had not been there before. She stopped just a few feet away, her hands clasped in front of her as if to steady herself. I really didn't mean to treat you like that. I didn't realize who you were, and I made a mistake." Sophia turned to face her, her expression unreadable. She had heard enough of these kinds of apologies before, half-hearted, filled with excuses. But she wasn't interested in playing the game of pretending things could be easily fixed with words alone. This wasn't a matter of just understanding who Sophia was. It was about realizing the consequences of treating someone based on assumptions. Sophia's gaze was calm, but unflinching. "It's not about who I am," she said slowly, choosing her words carefully. "It's about how you treated me the moment you assumed I didn't belong. No one deserves to be treated like that, no matter their background, no matter their appearance." Claudia's face reddened slightly, a flash of discomfort passing over her features. It was as if the weight of her actions was starting to sink in. She opened her mouth to respond, but closed it just as quickly, unsure of what to say. The apology she had been trying to form seemed to fall short, and she shifted uncomfortably on her feet. For the first time since the beginning of this encounter, Claudia seemed truly out of her depth. "I'm sorry," Claudia repeated, the words now sounding more genuine. "I was wrong. I never should have made assumptions about you." There was a brief pause, and Claudia glanced down at her hands, then back up at Sophia, her eyes showing a mix of embarrassment and regret. "It wasn't right, and I should have handled it differently." Sophia took a deep breath, allowing the silence to settle between them. She wasn't going to give Claudia the satisfaction of forgiving her immediately. This wasn't just about letting things slide. This was about making sure that Claudia understood the full weight of her actions. The way she had treated Sophia was unacceptable, and just saying sorry wasn't enough. But as she stood there, Sophia realized that there wasn't much more to say. The flight attendant had made a mistake, but at least now she seemed to understand the gravity of it. The silence between them was thick, but just as it seemed like things would become even more awkward, a voice called out from the back of the plane. "Everything okay up there?" It was the captain, his voice calm but filled with authority. Sophia turned slightly toward the doorway, her eyes narrowing just a little. She didn't know if this was going to make things better or worse, but at this point, she didn't care. She wasn't going to let this issue slip away unnoticed. Claudia quickly straightened her posture and turned toward the captain, trying to regain some of her earlier confidence. "Yes, Captain, everything is fine," she said, though her voice was still shaky. She looked back at Sophia and then at the captain, her unease evident. But the captain didn't respond to Claudia. Instead, he turned his attention directly to Sophia. "Miss Martinez," he said, his tone respectful, I'm sorry for the inconvenience you've faced today. I've been informed of the situation, and I want you to know that we'll make sure this doesn't happen again." Sophia raised an eyebrow. She wasn't expecting this level of involvement, but the captain's words were reassuring. It wasn't just Claudia now. The entire airline was taking notice. This wasn't going to be swept under the rug, and she appreciated that. "Thank you," Sophia said, her voice steady. "But this shouldn't have happened in the first place." The captain nodded, his expression serious. "We take full responsibility. This kind of behavior is unacceptable, and it will be addressed." He turned to Claudia then, his gaze firm but not unkind. "Please make sure this doesn't happen again." Claudia nodded quickly, her face pale. She didn't speak again, and as the captain stepped away, she remained silent, her eyes cast downward. The brief interaction had been a moment of accountability, one that Claudia hadn't been prepared for. She seemed to understand that this wasn't just about apologizing, it was about recognizing that her actions had consequences. And now, those consequences were beginning to unfold in front of her. As the captain returned to his duties and Claudia continued her work, Sophia sat back in her seat, the events of the day replaying in her mind. It wasn't over yet. There was still much to be done. But for the first time in hours, she felt a sense of peace settle over her. Whatever happened next, she knew she had done the right thing by standing up for herself. The plane continued its journey, and though the situation had been tense, the air felt a little lighter now. Sophia was ready for whatever came next, knowing that she would face it with the same quiet strength she always had. As the hours passed, Sophia couldn't help but notice the shift in the atmosphere aboard the plane. The tension that had filled the cabin earlier had begun to dissipate, but it wasn't because Claudia had apologized or because the situation had been resolved. It was because, despite everything that had happened, Sophia had not let herself be broken. She had stood her ground, quietly defiant in the face of humiliation, and that strength seemed to have changed the energy around her. The passengers, once so quick to judge, now seemed to regard her with a newfound respect. Some still glanced at her with curiosity, but others looked at her with quiet admiration. They had seen her fight for what was right, even when it wasn't easy. They had witnessed how she had maintained her composure under pressure, something that most people could only dream of. It was as though, without saying a word, she had made a statement to everyone around her. This was a woman who commanded respect, not because of who she was, but because of how she carried herself. Sophia leaned back in her seat, glancing out of the window at the endless sky. The clouds below looked like a sea of white, stretching out for miles. She took a deep breath, the calming hum of the plane filling her ears as she let the peacefulness of the moment settle over her. Despite the discomfort of the earlier confrontation, she felt a sense of clarity. She had faced something uncomfortable, something unjust, and had refused to back down. And, in doing so, she had grown stronger. There was a quiet power in that. A soft chime from her phone broke her thoughts. It was a message from her father, Victor. His words were always steady, always calming, and they reminded her that no matter what, she had the support of the people who truly mattered. "I spoke with the airline. They're taking immediate steps to address the issue. You handled yourself with grace, and I'm proud of you." Sophia smiled at the message, feeling a wave of warmth wash over her. It wasn't just about the confrontation anymore. It was about knowing that her father was there, not just to support her in the moment, but to ensure that no one else would ever have to go through what she had. But as the plane cruised on, Sophia knew that this wasn't the end of the story. There was something more she needed to do, something that would ensure that this incident wasn't forgotten. She couldn't let herself become just another victim of prejudice, no matter how small the situation might seem. She had to make sure the airline understood that this kind of behavior could not go unchecked. The plane began its descent, and as the seatbelt sign lit up, Sophia glanced toward the front of the cabin. She noticed that Claudia was now working with a quiet intensity. Gone were the previous signs of arrogance and authority that she had carried earlier in the flight. Now she seemed almost humble, her movements careful as she attended to the passengers in first class. It was as though the encounter had knocked her off her pedestal, and she was unsure of how to regain her footing. Sophia observed her for a moment longer, but this time there was no judgment in her eyes. Claudia was clearly struggling with the weight of her actions, and Sophia could sense that she wasn't the same person who had challenged her earlier. The air of superiority had vanished, replaced by something closer to remorse. The plane touched down, the wheels making a soft thud against the runway, as it slowed to a stop. For a brief moment, everything felt still. The passengers began to gather their belongings, preparing to exit. But Sophia didn't move immediately. She remained seated, her thoughts still running over everything that had happened. She felt a tap on her shoulder. Turning, she was surprised to see a fellow first-class passenger, the older woman, who had spoken up for her earlier. The woman smiled kindly, her eyes filled with sympathy. "I just wanted to say," the woman began, her voice soft, "I'm really sorry you had to go through that. You handled it with such dignity. Not everyone would have reacted the way you did." Sophia nodded, her smile faint but appreciative. "Thank you," she replied quietly, her voice steady. "It wasn't easy, but I knew I couldn't just let it go." The woman's eyes sparkled with understanding. "You're a lot stronger than most people give you credit for, and I think that's something worth recognizing." Sophia felt a swell of pride at the words. It wasn't about the acknowledgement from the other passengers. It was about knowing that she had made an impact, that her actions had resonated beyond just herself. As the passengers began to exit the plane, Sophia stood up and walked toward the door. Her posture was confident, her steps purposeful, and as she reached the threshold, she paused for a moment. Claudia was standing near the exit, her eyes catching Sophia's for just a second. There was no longer any trace of the earlier tension between them. Instead, Claudia simply nodded, a silent acknowledgement of the situation that had unfolded, her face tinged with regret. Sophia didn't respond. She didn't need to. The acknowledgement was enough. There was no need for further words. She had already made her point. With that, she walked off the plane, feeling a sense of finality as she stepped into the terminal. There would be more challenges ahead, more people who would try to judge her before getting to know her, but she was ready for it. She had learned that standing up for herself wasn't just about fighting back, it was about staying true to who she was, no matter what anyone else thought. And with that quiet certainty, she walked forward into the next chapter of her journey. As Sophia stepped into the terminal, the familiar hustle of the airport greeted her once again. The usual chaos of travelers rushing from one gate to another, the soft murmur of conversations, the clinking sound of luggage being pulled behind, all of it was a reminder of the world outside of her personal battle. She had faced the tension, the judgment, and had come out the other side stronger. But she knew this wouldn't be the last time she'd face a similar situation. The world was full of biases, and the challenge now was to ensure that these moments didn't define her, but instead fueled her. She made her way to the baggage claim area, her steps steady. Her phone buzzed again, and she pulled it from her purse. It was another message from her father. "I'll be in the city by the time you arrive. Let's talk more about everything later. You're doing great." Sophia felt a small smile tug at her lips. Her father's words were always a grounding force for her. Victor had been a constant in her life, not just as a father, but as a mentor, guiding her through the toughest moments of her career. He had always taught her the importance of standing up for what was right. And today, despite everything, she felt like she had done just that. As she reached the baggage carousel, her mind shifted from the confrontation aboard the plane to the larger picture ahead. There was a meeting with potential investors in just a few hours, and this would be a pivotal moment in her career. The events on the plane had tested her patience and resolve, but they also gave her a clearer sense of the direction she needed to take. She wasn't going to let this small setback define her. It would be a stepping stone to something greater. Her suitcase finally appeared on the carousel and she grabbed it, rolling it toward the exit. But as she approached the doors, she felt a familiar wave of uncertainty. Could the airline make things right? Would they genuinely address the issue, or would it be buried under the weight of corporate interests? She wasn't sure, but she knew she had planted the seed for change. As Sophia arrived at the hotel and checked into her room, she took a moment to herself. The room was quiet, with soft, calming colors and large windows that framed the city skyline. For a brief moment, she let herself relax, sinking into the plush armchair by the window. She closed her eyes, taking in the serenity of the space, trying to clear her mind before the whirlwind of her meetings began. But the thoughts of the flight and the way she had been treated didn't fade. They lingered, a reminder of how ingrained prejudice could be in the simplest of moments. Claudia hadn't just dismissed her that day because of her appearance. There had been something deeper, a bias that went beyond her appearance and into assumptions about her place in the world. And that was something that Sophia couldn't just let go of. It wasn't just about the seat on the plane. It was about confronting the idea that people, especially women like her, were too often judged before they were even given a chance to show their worth. Her phone buzzed again. This time, it was an email from the airline. Sophia opened it, her eyes scanning the contents. It was a formal apology, acknowledging the mistreatment she had faced during her flight. The airline had expressed regret for the incident and assured her that steps would be taken to improve their training on inclusivity and respect for all passengers. They had also promised to reach out to her personally once they had reviewed the situation. Sophia paused for a moment, reading the email again. It was a start, but it wasn't enough. She knew the company had to do more than just send a few formal words. Action spoke louder than apologies, and she was going to ensure that the airline followed through on their promises. It wasn't about making an example out of anyone. It was about ensuring that no one else would face what she had faced. The next morning, as Sophia entered the conference room for her meeting with the investors, she felt the weight of the previous day's events begin to lift. The room was filled with important faces, people who had the power to shape the direction of her next big project. She had prepared for this moment for months, and now it was time to show them the strength of her vision. Her presence in the room was calm, but there was a noticeable shift in how she carried herself. It wasn't just the smooth confidence that came with years of experience, it was the quiet strength that had been forged through the challenges of the past few days. Sophia felt more grounded, more focused. She wasn't just a businesswoman presenting a proposal. She was someone who had stood up for herself in the face of injustice, and she was ready to prove that she had the resilience to tackle whatever lay ahead. The meeting began, and as the conversation turned toward potential investments and new ventures, Sophia took the lead, her voice steady and confident. The investors listened, their expressions attentive, but Sophia could tell they were also paying attention to the change in her demeanor. There was a clarity in her that hadn't been there before, a calm determination that carried weight in every word she spoke. Halfway through the presentation, one of the investors, a man who had been silent up until now, leaned forward. "Sophia," he said, his tone respectful, "I have to admit I'm impressed. Your vision is compelling, but what's even more impressive is how you've carried yourself through some pretty challenging situations. That speaks volumes about your character." The words caught her off guard, but she didn't flinch. She met his gaze and smiled, her response quiet but firm. "Thank you. I believe in what I'm building, but I also believe in the importance of staying true to my values, no matter what obstacles come my way." It was a simple statement, but it carried the weight of everything she had just experienced. It wasn't just about business anymore. It was about integrity, about standing up for what was right, even when it was difficult, even when it felt like the world was pushing back. As the meeting continued, Sophia knew she was on the right path. She had not only stood up for herself on the plane, but now she was standing up for her future, her vision, and nothing was going to take that away. After the meeting, Sophia found herself walking back to her hotel with a lightness in her step that had not been there earlier. The presentation had gone better than she had expected, and the investors were not only interested in her proposal, they were impressed with her character. She knew that the battle for respect was ongoing, and today she had won an important one. But the earlier confrontation with Claudia on the plane was still on her mind, and she knew that she couldn't just leave it behind. Her phone buzzed as she walked through the bustling streets. It was another message from her father. "I heard from the airline. They're taking steps to address what happened, but I want you to know something. You've taught me more than I could have imagined about how to handle adversity with grace. Don't let anyone make you feel small, darling. You're meant for bigger things." Sophia smiled at the words. Her father had always been a rock for her, but now she felt like she was beginning to step into her own strength. This wasn't just about him anymore. This was her journey, and she was finally starting to see how far she could go when she stood firm in her own power. When she reached the hotel lobby, she checked in with her assistant, confirming a few details for the next set of meetings. But as she sat in the quiet of the lobby, sipping her coffee, her thoughts turned back to Claudia. She had been humiliated, pushed to the edge, and yet it was as if Claudia had been the one to walk away defeated. It wasn't just because of the intervention from the captain, it was because Sophia had maintained her dignity, even when it was difficult. But the more Sophia thought about it, the more she realized that Claudia had a story too. Yes, she had made a huge mistake, but mistakes didn't define people. How they grew from them did. As much as Sophia had been wronged, she knew that forgiveness wasn't about letting someone off the hook. It was about acknowledging the lessons learned, both for herself and for the person who had hurt her. Sophia spent the rest of the afternoon working through her emails and finalizing the details of her upcoming meetings. Her thoughts kept drifting back to the situation with Claudia, and she couldn't help but wonder what had led the flight attendant to act the way she had. She hadn't been outright malicious, but there had been something in her demeanor, in the way she dismissed Sophia, that felt like more than just a misunderstanding. It was a reflection of something deeper, something that needed to be addressed. Later that evening, as Sophia prepared to attend a dinner with a potential business partner, she received another email from the airline. It was from the CEO, Victor Bennett. His message was brief but direct. "Dear Miss Martinez, I want to personally apologize for the incident on your recent flight. We take full responsibility for the actions of our staff, and I assure you that steps are already being taken to improve our internal training programs on respect, diversity, and professionalism. This incident is being used as a learning opportunity for our team. We are committed to ensuring that something like this never happens again. If there is anything I can do to personally make it right, please don't hesitate to contact me." Sophia read the email carefully, taking in the CEO's words. She appreciated the formal apology, but she knew that actions spoke louder than words. The true measure of the airline's commitment would be in how they followed through on these promises. She quickly typed a response, acknowledging the apology but making it clear that she would be following up to ensure real change. "Thank you for your email, Mr. Bennett. I appreciate the apology and the commitment to making improvements. However, I would like to emphasize that this is not just about one incident. It's about ensuring that all passengers are treated with the dignity and respect they deserve, regardless of their background. I look forward to seeing how the company addresses this issue in the long term." Sophia hit send and felt a small sense of relief. The situation wasn't fully resolved, but it was a start. She had made sure that her voice was heard, and now it was up to the airline to show they were truly committed to change. The next day, after a long day of meetings and negotiations, Sophia found herself sitting in a quiet corner of the hotel bar, reflecting on the whirlwind of the past few days. She had successfully secured a partnership that would help her expand her business even further, but despite the excitement of her professional triumphs, her mind kept drifting back to the flight, to Claudia, to the way things had unfolded. She wasn't angry anymore, but she still felt a sense of discomfort about how people could so easily make assumptions about others based on their appearance or background. Claudia had acted out of her own biases, but it wasn't just her problem. It was a reflection of a broader issue in society. It wasn't enough to simply point out the wrongs of others. People needed to be taught, to be made to understand the impact of their actions. Sophia pulled her phone out again, scrolling through her messages. The buzz of incoming notifications was almost constant now. Business proposals, partnership updates, and news from her father, all flowing in one after the other. But amidst the noise, one message stood out to her. It was from a former colleague, someone she had worked with years ago. It read, "Sophia, I heard about what happened with the flight. I just want to say how much respect I have for how you handled the situation. You've always been an inspiration to me, and I'm sure you're helping others see the value of standing up for what's right." Sophia felt a smile spread across her face as she read the message. It wasn't just about the business deals, the partnerships, or the triumphs in the boardroom. It was about moments like these where her actions, her character, had made an impact on others. She put the phone down for a moment, looking out the window at the city lights below. It wasn't just about what she achieved. It was about how she lived, how she stood tall in the face of adversity. And as she reflected on everything that had transpired, she realized that her journey wasn't just about building a business empire. It was about changing the world, one small step at a time, and that small step had begun on that plane. The days that followed were a blur of meetings, decisions, and the steady hum of business. Sophia had successfully navigated the week's challenges and secured the deals that would propel her company into a new phase of growth. But as she continued to build her empire, she found herself thinking more and more about the lesson that had emerged from her experience on the plane. The following week, she received another email from the airline. This time, it was an update on their progress. They had implemented new staff training programs focused on diversity, inclusion, and handling difficult situations with professionalism. They acknowledged that her experience had highlighted weaknesses in their training, and they were committed to making sure that something like that would never happen again. They also thanked her for being a part of the catalyst for change. Sophia read through the email carefully, nodding to herself as she finished. It wasn't just the apology that mattered now, it was the follow-through. She felt a small sense of satisfaction knowing that her actions had led to something positive. She hadn't just stood up for herself. She had made a difference for others who might one day find themselves in a similar situation. She had always believed that real power came not from how much money or influence one had, but from the ability to change things for the better, to leave a positive impact on the world around her. And now she could see that her actions had done just that. She had turned an unpleasant experience into something that could create lasting change. But there was still more to be done. Sophia knew that her work wasn't finished. She wasn't the type of person who rested on her laurels. She was constantly looking for ways to improve, to do better, and to ensure that the progress she had made continued to ripple outward. This was only the beginning. A few weeks later, Sophia found herself back on another flight, this time for an international business conference in London. As she made her way to the gate, she couldn't help but smile at the irony. The last time she had flown, she had faced judgment and prejudice from a flight attendant. This time, however, she felt nothing but excitement for the opportunities ahead. The flight was smooth, the service was impeccable, and Sophia found herself relaxing into the comfortable first-class seat. It wasn't just the luxury of the seat that made her feel at ease, though. It was the knowledge that she had weathered the storm and come out stronger on the other side. The turbulence she had faced on that plane was nothing compared to what she had achieved since then. As she settled into her seat, she couldn't help but reflect on everything that had led her to this point. The challenges she had faced in her career, the prejudices she had overcome, and the strength she had discovered within herself. But more than anything, she realized that this wasn't just about her. It was about everyone who had ever been made to feel less than they were because of the assumptions others made about them. Sophia knew that her story was just one example in a much larger conversation about equality and respect. She had always been an advocate for fairness, but now her passion for these issues had grown even more. She wanted to make sure that her company wasn't just a place where business was done. It was a place where everyone, regardless of who they were or where they came from, could feel valued. As the flight attendant came to offer her a drink, Sophia couldn't help but notice the small, subtle difference in how she was treated. There was no hesitation, no judgment, just the same respect and professionalism that she had earned, and that she would continue to demand for everyone who crossed her path. When Sophia arrived in London, she was greeted by a team of executives who were eager to discuss the expansion of her company's global presence. The next few days were filled with negotiations, strategy sessions, and new partnerships. But even amidst the whirlwind of business, Sophia found time to think about the bigger picture. She had made significant progress in her career, but the incident with the flight attendant had taught her something more important than any business deal ever could. It had reminded her that success wasn't just about what you achieved, it was about how you achieved it and the impact you left on others. The way you treated people, the respect you showed, and the courage you had to stand up for what was right, all of that was just as important as any financial milestone. Sophia spent a quiet evening in her hotel room, reflecting on her journey. She thought about Claudia, the flight attendant, and how her actions had inadvertently sparked a shift in her own perspective. She wasn't sure where Claudia's story would go from here, but Sophia hoped that the woman had learned something valuable. She knew firsthand how hard it was to unlearn biases and prejudices, but it was possible. People could change, and she hoped that this was just the beginning of Claudia's own transformation. The next morning, as she prepared for another round of meetings, Sophia felt a renewed sense of purpose. She wasn't just building a business empire, she was creating a legacy that wasn't just defined by profit margins or market shares, but by the principles of fairness, equality, and respect. A legacy that would one day inspire others to rise above the challenges they faced and make the world a better place for everyone. And with that, Sophia stood, ready to face whatever came next, knowing that the real power was in her ability to bring about change, no matter how small, one step at a time. As the months went by, Sophia's company continued to grow, and so did her influence within the business world. She had become a symbol of resilience, someone who not only rose to the top, but did so while holding firm to her values. Her story about standing up for herself on that flight had spread beyond the boardrooms and into the hearts of many who admired her courage. It wasn't just about her wealth or success. It was about how she had turned a moment of humiliation into a powerful statement about dignity and respect. Sophia's actions had sparked changes, not just within her company, but also within the airline industry. She received messages from passengers who had faced similar situations, thanking her for standing up for what was right. Some shared their own stories of discrimination and how Sophia's response had inspired them to do the same in their lives. One of the most significant outcomes of the incident was the partnership Sophia had forged with the airline's leadership team. After the formal apology, They worked together on several initiatives aimed at improving the customer experience. The airline had implemented mandatory diversity and inclusion training across all levels of staff. Sophia was even invited to participate in a panel discussion at a major industry event where she shared her experience and her vision for creating a more inclusive world. The experience had changed her in ways she hadn't anticipated. It reminded her of the power of standing firm in one's convictions, of refusing to back down even when the odds seemed stacked against you. But more importantly, it showed her that change was possible, even in the smallest of actions. Every decision she made, every step she took, could be a catalyst for something greater. One evening, after a particularly long day of meetings, Sophia found herself sitting by the window of her office, watching the sunset over the city skyline. It was quiet now, the usual hustle and bustle of the office had settled, and she could finally reflect on the journey she had been on. She thought about how far she had come, how a single, uncomfortable incident on a plane had set into motion a series of events that had brought about real change. Her thoughts turned to Claudia again, the flight attendant who had been the cause of her discomfort, but ultimately helped her realize her own strength. Sophia wasn't sure what had become of Claudia, but she hoped that the woman had learned something from the incident. Perhaps, like Sophia, Claudia was changing too. People made mistakes, but it was how they learned from them that mattered. Sophia had always believed in second chances, and she hoped that Claudia was using hers to grow into someone who would never again judge another person based on their appearance or assumptions. Sophia smiled to herself, knowing that her own journey had only just begun. She had faced challenges in her career before, but this one had been different. It had taught her something deeper than business skills or strategic thinking. It had taught her that every person deserved to be seen for who they truly were, and not judged by how they looked or what others assumed about them. As she thought about her future, Sophia realized that the true power wasn't in the deal she made or the contracts she signed. It was in her ability to inspire others to do better, to treat each other with respect and kindness, and to use her platform to create lasting change in the world. That, she decided, would be her legacy. The years passed, and Sophia's impact on the world only grew stronger. She continued to lead her company, but her role had evolved into something far more influential than she had ever imagined. She became a sought-after speaker, sharing her story of resilience, empowerment, and the importance of diversity and inclusion in business. Her talks inspired countless others to stand up for themselves, to challenge the status quo, and to always act with integrity, no matter what the world threw at them. Sophia had built more than just a business empire. She had created a movement that encouraged individuals to believe in their worth, to recognize the inherent dignity in others, and to always treat each person with respect, regardless of their background. One day, as she walked through the corridors of her headquarters, Sophia passed by a plaque on the wall that read, "Empowered people create empowered companies." It was a simple reminder of the values she had built her empire on, the values that had guided her through everything, from the struggles in the boardroom to the challenges in the air. She paused for a moment, her reflection in the glass catching her eye. She had come a long way from that day on the plane when she had been judged and humiliated by a flight attendant. That incident had been the turning point, the moment that had forced her to confront the way the world saw her and the way she saw herself. It had been a catalyst for change, not just in her life, but in the lives of others. As she walked into her office, she felt a sense of peace wash over her. She had done what she set out to do. She had faced the adversity, turned it into a lesson, and used it to fuel her mission of creating a world where everyone, regardless of their background, was treated with respect. And with that, Sophia Martinez knew she had truly made a difference. She had not only built a legacy of success, but one of respect fairness, and lasting change. The journey was far from over, but for the first time, she was content.